In a bid to expand the tax base and boost revenue, Nigeria's revenue agency, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, has joined forces with the Market Traders Association of Nigeria MATAN to collect valued added tax, VAT, from informal traders. This partnership is part of President Bola Tinubu's ambitious reform agenda aimed at revitalizing the country's sluggish growth. Nigeria currently faces one of the lowest tax collection rates globally, with only around 10.8% of GDP being collected as tax revenue, according to the agency. To address this issue, the FIRS plans to leverage MATAN's extensive network of over 40 million traders, many operating in the informal sector, through the implementation of a digital platform. Now, this collaboration aims to curb illegal tax collection activities by unauthorized individuals and streamline the process of tax collection. Now, the questions are, is this another reform too soon? Could this bold move indeed be the solution to raking in more tax revenue from an economy largely comprised of informal players? Let's find out. I am Kemini Amano, and you're welcome to The Square. Joining our gathering are Olushiji Aina. He's development economist. He's based in Lagos, Nigeria. We also have Basil Abia. He's research associate of Quaco Research, based in Abuja. Gentlemen, you're welcome to The Square.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure to be here.
Indeed. I want to start with you. Do you say Basil or Basil? I just want to make sure that I'm getting it right. But while you answer that, I do want to find out from you, this is something that economists have spoken about time without number, expanding the tax base and raking in tax revenue from the largely informal sector of the economy. This is good news, isn't it, Basil?
This is not good news.
Come on now. Come on now. Tell me why. Tell me why.
So I'm looking at it from a macro lens. This is undoubtedly the busiest Nigeria has ever been in terms of implementing policy reforms. We're floating the naira on the importers, on the investors and exporters foreign exchange window, with the view to finally unifying, of course, our FX rate and our FX window. We've just removed our full subsidies on PMS. First time in 43 years. You know, these price shocks are really affecting Nigerians, and that's going to affect productivity. We need to be very careful on how we implement, how fast we're implementing these reforms. This particular reform is one too soon, and it is not informed by conventional macroeconomics. And I'll explain why. First and foremost, as you know, 93% of all of the employment in Nigeria is carried out by the informal economy. A huge chunk of our earnings, of our income, obviously, is provided by the informal economy, and 57% of our GDP. That is the size of Nigeria's informal economy. The Nigerian informal economy is just coming out from one particular tragedy. The botched CPN demonetization policy that absolutely, brutalized that particular facet of the Nigerian macroeconomy. I have a lot of anecdotal and empirical data to back just how damaging it was, especially during the peak period from February to April. A lot of small micro businesses in the informal economy closed down. A lot of artisans had to close down their shops and return back to rural areas. We even noticed some form of reverse migration where folks in the semi-urban or the peri-urban areas and the urban areas were moving back to the rural areas because there was nothing, the margins were just too minuscule for them to be able to survive. And so they felt if they go back to the villages and farm, they can feed at least, and you do know that poverty exposure for low-income Nigerians is super high in urban and peri-urban areas due to the high cost of living in our urban areas. So from a macroeconomic lens, this is too soon because we're already enduring price shocks. The removal of full subsidy, 7.5% VAT on diesel. A lot of these things are price shocks that can be have dastard effects on our productivity levels. And if
Very well.
don't find a way to
Basil, I'm going to come back. Just hold your thought for me. I'll come back to you, and then you paint us, a better picture of how dire the situation is for the informal sector, based on the recent what you call shocks that we've experienced the last few months of the Tinubu administration. But let me pick also the thoughts of Olushiji. Tell us what you think about this.
All right. Thank you once again for having me. And I quite understand the angle my co-panelist is looking at it from. From statistical construct perspective, looking at the kind of data that has been thrown out, especially pre-emergence of this administration, you can say is not good. And because also perhaps because of the layers of different levels of policy interventions, you may say is not ideal at this point. But if you're looking at it from structural and institutional point of view, looking at the way Nigeria has been in the last couple of years, 60 years, nothing is working, structures and systems are lacking, then I'll tell you it's a good thing. Now, it's a function of carrot and stick approach, whether the stick comes before the carrot or carrot comes before the stick. In this scenario, it appears that the stick comes before the carrot, but the carrot will eventually come. Because if you look at the informal sector, again, you will agree with me that that sector represents close to about 60%, and it's estimated to be buoyant to tune of about $2 billion, and that's a very huge chunk of that. According to International Labour Organization, they affirm that 60%, over 60% of jobs generated, are generated or the employed people are largely from the informal sector. So that is established. But what is going to happen, or what you're going to see happen in the next couple of months or year, is perhaps being able to capture in these people. Don't forget that the financial inclusion drive in this country has taken a long toll over the last couple of years without much of achievement. And that was why, if you look at the policy, one of the monetary policy of CBN in the last previous administration, when the Naira issue came on board, it was a major disaster. Because why? Our level of financial inclusion is very limited. And if you look at this particular one, it shows that there will be more attention for the informal sector, and many of them will be brought from that informal sector to the formal sector. So what will happen? There will be a lot of incentives and opportunities that will come. People are not saying that. People are still a bit doubtful whether this administration will be able to roll out those incentives to be able to mitigate against the shocks that my colleague has rightly highlighted. But again, if you look at the history of the leadership in terms of the president himself and what happened in Lagos State, you will know that it's not a new thing. It happened in Lagos State, during his own administration, and a lot of people felt it's going to be a major disaster, especially it was because maybe the president then was not giving them their monthly allocation. But if you now look at what has happened in Lagos State in the last 16 years, then you will agree with me that a lot of those folks in the informal sector have been brought to formal sector. A lot of incentives, a lot of grants, a lot of single-digit loan has been given to them to be able to help, stimulate the economy in terms of supporting their businesses.
I really do hope. Indeed. I really do want us to get into incentivization, a little later in our discussion. But I come back to Basil. Basil, tell us a bit more about this dire effect that, the recent reforms have had on the informal sector. You were telling us earlier that businesses have had to close. Dig into those figures a bit more for us.
So, first and foremost, you have to look at the way our inflation rate is spiraling. Obviously, it's going to take a while for the transmission effect. In macroeconomics, we call it the transmission effect. When certain price shocks due to certain policy reforms are carried out, it takes 2, 3, sometimes a year for the full transmission effect to take full effect. So in the context of the shocks, we're seeing higher food inflation due to a lot of factors. First and foremost, it is super expensive to import food. Secondly, we're not producing enough food to meet our demand. Third, it's super expensive to transport food from the rural areas to the peri-urban and urban areas. And with the removal of subsidy and with the additional 7.5% levy on diesel, and a lot of the trucks and lorries that actually transport our food, it's carried out, they use diesel as their fuel source or their energy sources. And then you also now look at the fact that over 90% of the vehicular and human traffic is carried by our roads, and just 20% of our roads are fully tarred. All of these statistics just dive into the bidirectionality of the price shocks. Every little burden that you're adding to the informal sector and the formal sector is spiraling into higher inflation rate, and is pushing people to either reduce production and service units, or even just shut out services and decide to either go to rural areas or stay unemployed. Another number to add is the recent World Bank biannual report on Nigeria. I think, if I'm not mistaken, where the data sources from, I do know that due to these particular price shocks and the cash crunch caused by the CBN botched demonetization policy, we have added about 4 million Nigerians into extreme poverty levels. I have to remind Nigerians who are listening to me right now, last year during the multi-dimensional poverty index report by the National Bureau of Statistics, over 133 million Nigerians are multi-dimensionally poor. So when you have a situation where the informal sector is dominant, not only in employment, but in income, these price shocks are forcing people to stop doing businesses or to reduce their margins. And when they're reducing their margins, their earnings are tanking, their purchasing power reduces. And when their purchasing power reduces, the entire circular economy is affected, and that's exactly what we're currently seeing right now. So I think my own argument, this is, just give me a second. My own argument here is not that this new policy is not good. It is very good because we have one of the lowest tax collection rates in the world. We have one of the lowest actual tax revenue collected ratio to potential revenue collected in the world. We have very poor tax collection numbers, no doubt about that. My own argument against this is that it is too soon. We need to wait for the transmission effect of these recent macroeconomic policy reforms to take effect. And when that happens, then we can now decide to start staggering in this new VAT collection for the informal economy. I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back to you. Constitutional argument as well.
I see. You'll make that argument in a bit, but I'm going to come back to you on timing also. But let's turn attention to Olushiji right now and ask, based on all that Basil has told us, the impact it could have, prices could go up, which would mean that people's purchasing power would reduce. Goods and services could go up, affecting our inflation. It's talked about the fact that people would not have money to run their businesses anymore. We're expecting some businesses to go down as well. Is it worth the carrot at the end of the day?
Like I said, we should put the egg before the chicken, or put the chicken before the egg. We need to also be able to wait for FRS to be able to downplay all of the processes and procedures and what the charges is going to look like. Again, we can argue that the timing is wrong for whatever it is, but then we need to also be patient to be able to understand how all of this is going to play out. For example, and I'll give you 2 typical examples. In Kano, one of the largest markets in Nigeria is in Kano State, where there is informal transactions to the tune of about 20 billion on a daily basis. Nobody regulates the market. Nobody knows what happens to that market. Nobody supports infrastructures in that market. That will enable all of these to be able to be fashioned out in a way that support system will be created for the informal sector. Number 2, if you look at what happened in Borno State, I think yesterday, where the governor bought about 80 buses, for the traders and for the farmers to be able to support, whatever they are doing, move product from those rural areas, to the commercial areas. So it's an inclusive thing. It's not just because of the pronouncement of the federal inland revenue. The state inland revenue will work in synchrony, will synchronize whatever they are doing with the FRSC. They will work with the state government. So it's not going to be, the same cane whipped all over the country. So the effect, there's no doubt there will be some short-term effect, when this is rolled out. But let's not look at the amount that will be charged, individual businesses and all of that. Let us look at the entire structure. Let us look at the entire chain, the opportunities that are coming in, the incentives that is going to be given. Because all of this will be rolled out in the document, that will be shared for public consumption at some point. And until we are able to get details into that document, before we can be able to say, whether the timing is right or whether the timing is wrong. At the same time, at some point in the past administration, we queried the 40 million register of the very poor. How they came about that register, nobody understands. Financial inclusion, we don't know. So again, this will help to be able to, in a way, remove some concerns, around the way the federal government, releases funds to some of these extremely poor businesses or extremely poor individuals, because we need to begin to look at this administration from a different perspective. No wonder it's not about the political party. It's more about the kind of steps, the kind of initiatives that this administration has begun to, roll out in the last couple of days since they came into power. And then we must be able to give them some element of trust at this point to see how all of this is going to span out over the time. So in conclusion, I have no problem saying that the effect will be the same, but then it's going to be for a short time. It's going to be for a short time because no matter what we do, the informal sector is a very critical part of this economy, and somebody must be able to look into that to see how they can create a support system for the informal sector to be able to function optimally, and again, to be able to increase our GDP over the next 4 years.
Let's do a last one on the debate on whether or not this is coming at a good time. In fact, whether or not it is going to work for us at all. And Basil, talk to us about timing. You said the government should have waited for what has been faced already to transition properly, gauge the effects on people before bringing this on. So based on your research, based on what you know, what would have been the appropriate time for this to have happened? But you were also saying that you needed to make a point on the constitutionality of this. If I got you right, make that point as well. So we move on from that.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you very much, Kevin. And a phenomenal argument, by the way, from my colleague in Lagos. I have to say this. In the research community in Nigeria, the policy think tank community in Nigeria, development economists everywhere, there's a conventional agreement that we needed to remove the fuel subsidies. There's a conventional agreement that we need to increase taxation levels, widen the tax net. No doubt about that. To also ensure that our foreign exchange is based on the mechanism of the free market. My grouse, and I think my perspective is this, taking it time by time, having a proper structure where there are certain palliative and remedial measures to be able to counter the price shock effects so that we don't have the situation that we had in 2016 when we went into another recession. Nigeria's productivity is already very much battered by high energy costs, as well as very devalued naira. Now, what you're doing here is when you're introducing this particular informal taxation period, let's not also forget that already the bulk of the goods and the services that these folks in the informal sector already provide is already taxed. There's a 7.5% VAT tax on these goods. So when you're adding another 7.5% tax for these folks in the informal sector, you're burdening them. We have not also sorted out the problem of informal taxation in the form of area boys, market boys, and what we refer to in Lagos as a bon adubo or the agbero problem. It's still there. So are we going to find a way to be able to ensure that there's a cessation of these informal taxes? And there are a number of them. I'll give you some numbers. From the PwC, Taiwo Oyedele, he's probably the best tax consultant that we have in the country. He made a data announcement that I found very scary. Nigerians, across board, there are over 200 informal taxes that we pay, and there are over 60 formal taxes that we pay. There is an uncertainty about this. There's a multiplicity of taxation problem in this context. There's also a tax burden, yes, a tax burden, especially in the informal economy, about this. And all of this is transmitting to very high prices, which is transmitting to the very injurious inflation numbers, which might push us to a recession by the end of Q3 or the end of Q4. So we need to be very careful. We need to take our time with this. My advice would have been, if I was called to bring in my own perspective, my advice would have been to carry out the subsidy removal first, first 6 months with remedial measures that ensure that we counter the price shocks, and then do the devaluation of the naira just by the end of Q4 this year, so that by next year, when we're able to gauge the market reaction, we'll now be able to carry out this further widening. And now to my point about constitutionality, I do not believe that the federal government should be collecting VAT taxes. And there's historical context as well as a jurisprudence context to this. Historically, VAT, what we know as VAT, used to be referred to as sales taxes. Any Nigerian, I'm sure my senior colleague in Lagos would attest to this particular fact. These sales taxes prior to 1993 were collected by states, and they were distributed solely by the states. However, in 1993, the military decree, as you do know, our military administrations have absolutely no regard for the federalism that Nigeria should be practicing. They decided to basically convert that to VAT and say that the federal government was the sole collector of this particular tax. And that has been the case over time. The 1999 constitutional amendment did not adjust that to say, okay, VAT should be collected by states. And we do know that classic ruling at the Federal High Court in Port Harcourt that basically said Rivers State government and, of course, state governments should be the ones to collect taxes and redistribute. And I agree with that judgment. I know that it's currently being argued right now. It's still in the courts. The federal government will try and counter that. I also know that President Tinubu is of the school of, or was of the school of thought that states should collect the VAT taxes instead of the federal government. So I'm going to be watchful to see whether his stance on that is going to change. If that changes, then that's very hypocritical of the president.
That's already right.
To conclude my point, please, just give a couple of seconds here. When you look at tax, you have to be able to understand that the major perspective is to first incentivize productivity before taxing that productivity. What we're doing here is we're ensuring that productivity is shrinking and then further taxing. And there's a social anxiety problem to that. This could lead to a revolt if we're not careful. I'm a social scientist. I understand the repercussions of this. My argument here is find ways to incentivize productivity and then tax later. And we have to tax broadly, and we have to democratize and decentralize taxation. I do not agree that federal government should be collecting VAT taxes.
I want to take that point to Olushiji and pick his thoughts on that, on the constitutionality of this. What do you think about that?
Basil was right by laying very, very clear, in terms of what has happened over the years. But I think the case is still lying down with the Supreme Court. The case between the federal government and then the Rivers State government. But as at the appeal court judgment, the VAT should be collected by state. But then my argument is not even about, if you listen to my previous comment, I said the entire layers of the tax collectors or tax collection channels will be involved in this process, meaning that the state's independent revenue service or whatever it is will also be involved in this. And then they will be able to, in a way, itemize which line item can be collected by federal government, which line item can be collected by the state government, and all of that. I'm not sure they have released an official document that will back up this pronouncement. To me, it's just a pronouncement to say, this is what we have in mind, and this is going to happen. And just like Basil said, we must be able to incentivize production. I totally agree with that. And
so what I want us to do is to set the bar. If the federal government engages in the collection of this VAT at this point, given the status quo at our markets, it's an illegality. Is that what we're saying?
No, I've not established that because it's still with the Supreme Court. So that's what I'm saying.
It's an illegality.
Right.
So you might say it's illegal because of the appeal court pronouncement.
Right.
But the Supreme Court is the final court in this country. And then the MATAN is still pending with the Supreme Court between Rivers State government and the federal government. And until that pronouncement or final judgment is given, I want to be silent.
Well, so until the final judgment is given. Right, go ahead. I may be making the same point. So Basil, you make the point.
From a technical perspective, from a tax jurisprudence perspective, what we refer to as sales taxes or VAT taxes basically is when you tax production and services within a local area. So the local governments and the state governments, that's exactly the definition of that. And even from an historical constitutional point of view, it has almost always been collected by state governments and local government councils. Even if the Supreme Court says that the federal government should be in charge of VAT collection, I think that is against the conventional tenets of tax jurisprudence. So my argument is very philosophical, but it's also hinged on constitutionality and common sense. It is common sense for states to be able to tax productivity and the goods within their own locality. And that's why I believe that the VAT tax collection by the FIRS is an illegality.
But I do want to ask you this. I do want to ask you, before you come in, Olushiji, when you look at the FIRS, taxes for our markets, it specifically talks also about taxes and levies at markets, federally and state markets. And so that dynamic also plays in. If it's a federal market or within a federal jurisdiction, what happens? I see you're doing that, but I hope you can clarify for us. Do you have an answer to that? How those dynamics play in?
My answer is simple. I maybe accept the markets in the FCT, because the FCT is still supposedly under the federal government, even though that argument is now being challenged by the Labour Party right now. But state markets are almost always under the jurisdiction of states and local governments. I don't think there are markets that are under the jurisdiction of the federal government, except obviously the FCT. So in that context, this is also very flawed. There's also another asterisk to this particular model that the FIRS wants to use: the use of the Market Traders Association, MATAN, as a collaborator to this. This obviously gives me some fears, knowing how Lagos has handled taxation with special purpose vehicles, the opacity of this tax collection, the corruption that has been mired over the years. I'm sure you know about the Alpha Beta case. So I'm really worried that this particular collaboration with MATAN, the Market Traders Association of Nigeria, is going to yield to a special purpose vehicle coming into the picture, and there will be opacity about the collection, the earnings. Already the arrangement by
all right, Basil, hold on. You're going ahead of the conversation. We'll come to the likely challenges of this alliance, but I do want us to settle. We have very little time, but let's settle on this constitutional issue. Olushiji, you wanted to make a point, but also talk to me about the dynamics about when the FIRS talks about markets within federal and state jurisdictions. Because when you look at its list of taxes for our market areas, it has a different portion for markets funded by state, and then another portion for federal markets. What are we looking at? What does that even mean, really, in this context?
Yeah, under a standard federalism, kind of government, what Basil has said, comes to play in terms of who has jurisprudence over, collection of VAT. And I'll give you a quick example. I was in the state of Delaware, and I walked into a shop to buy something, to price something, basically. And then I got that particular item for about $20. So not too long, we took a drive down, and if you understand, between Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Newcastle, they are all, within the same axis, but they are different states. So I literally moved not up to 1 mile, and then I was in Maryland. And then the same item, I walked into the shop, to Walmart, to go and price it, and it was going for about $33. So I was worried. The same item, the same product, different prices. Why? Because in Delaware, it's practically zero VAT on some of those things. You pay low taxes. That is why you see all of the financial and digital wherever have their headquarters in Delaware.
Yeah.
Now, if you go to Maryland, go to New York City, the prices are different, and that is under normal conventional practice, and that is the way it should be. So when we're talking about VAT here, it should be a conversation that happens within the states. Like, say, a particular state that have more production will collect a particular amount. For example, Lagos can decide to say the cost of this should be lesser than what you see in Ogun State or what you see in Oyo State. And the same thing happens in Abuja, Nasarawa, and all of the environment. But then, I believe at some point, like I mentioned earlier, that the FRS will call all of the states. Don't also forget that there was a law that was passed for all of the state revenue service to be independent of the executive. In other words, they should be driven, they should be market driven. So I believe there will be conversation at some point to look at to have jurisprudence over a particular market or the other. But don't also forget that there are industries that got federal government approval before they started operations, whether in mining, whether in petroleum. Where will they pay their taxes to?
I see.
So it has to be discussed. Some part of it will be paid to the local government. Some part of it will be paid to the state government. While some part of it will be paid to the federal government.
Well,
I think that is the way the company has been operating within the Niger Delta region.
Gentlemen, I'll say this: we may not be able to settle that issue here, given our limited time, and really, I'd move on from that, from the constitutionality of this issue. We'll see how it plays out, in the coming days. Absolutely.
I think we're saying the same thing, but from different perspectives.
I agree with you, Basil.
Yeah.
But I do want us to look at the alliance itself. You've made some pronouncement about the alliance and the possibility of the difficulties that could come up with this alliance. But they say that there is a digital platform they want to use, and they are hoping that not only would it deal with transparency, but it also deal with the Agbaros you talk about, the people who are self-appointed tax collectors in our markets. Basil, would that be a good starting point to dealing with the concerns that you've mentioned?
I like to use Lagos as an example. Lagos, and I'll give them credit, Lagos state government, they digitized a huge chunk of their tax collection mediums, but that hasn't reduced the informal taxation problem in Lagos. I travel to Lagos as often as I can, and I have friends and family members who live in Lagos. We read the news, we know exactly what's happening. We're Nigerians, let's not lie to ourselves. This informal taxation problem is still there because of a lot of incentives and because of the power mediums between, of course, formal power structures that we have, which we know as public government, and then, of course, the informal power structures. And so this kind of alliance, we're now seeing it brought to the national space, and I'm very, very skeptical. Even if you digitize the process that we have seen in Lagos, informal taxation is still going to be very rife. There has to be more in the framework that FIRS is trying to bring out. There has to be more that de-incentivize informal taxation from being a problem. The tax burden on the informal economy is unbearable right now, and they're just surviving one particular shock. The cash demonetization program that really, there's also the opacity concern, the corruption concern. We have to watch closely how this arrangement works. I will not be surprised to see or hear about an SPV that is being floated to be able to handle some parts of the management and take their 5% management fees. We've seen that happen in Lagos, we've seen that happen in a couple of Nigerian states. So if that happens on the national stage, I will not be surprised. This is Nigeria. But as honest people, as people who really want the progress of Nigeria, it's important that we highlight all of these concerns, and that's exactly what I'm doing on national TV here. I'm really, really scared about this arrangement.
I see. I want to hear from you, Olusoji. Are you also scared about the mechanism chosen, the alliance between MATAN and the FIRS? And I mean, what would the alternative be in reining in the informal sector, really?
Again, I just want to allay the fears of Basil, because in a normal setting of search, you expect that it's going to be driven by PPP arrangements. It's not going to be driven by government itself, because we don't even have total trust in government. That is why till today, we cannot return back to toll, because the tolls that are being collected are not directly, reinvested back into the system where we can have more roads. And just like you have rightly established, 20% of our roads are motor, all across the country. But then if you look at an SPV that will be run, we need to first of all see the workability of that SPV in terms of the deployment of that solution, because I believe it's going to cost a lot of money to deploy such a solution that will be able to address more than 100 million people transacting on that on a daily basis. Don't forget that when Remita was going to come into place to solve a particular problem, with the public sector, they also wanted to collect their percentage, even though it was narrowed down at the National Assembly. But till tomorrow, remitters still have their own percentage that they collect. So I believe that they're going to work with the market association, they're going to work with the private sector, work with the banks, the financial institutions, they're going to work with all the fintech, and then there will be layers of charges that goes to individuals who contribute to the success of that deployment. So that is the way I see the entire alliance working. Now, the question in terms of corruption, before we begin to look at the way Alpha Beta works, let's just look at it from a broader perspective in terms of all the players that they are bringing into the system. I believe that each of the states' revenue services will be brought into that system. I believe that the market association will be brought into that system. The fintech will be brought into that system, and a lot of other players. And each of these people, including the financial institutions, will have their commissions. They will layer out all of that, all the incentives for all of them to be involved. And
well, we can only hope they do. While we do not have details of what.
Yeah, we do not have details, but I believe that is the one that's going to be.
No. Let me make the point. We do have a window of a window view of what they plan to do. They say that MATAN already has a digital system. They will enumerate their over 40 million members. So each of them will have an ID card to be able to have access to this digital system. And then they would also form an alliance, MATAN, some security forces, to deal with the issue of transparency. But that really is far from what you have said, Olushiji.
No, it's not far. Because behind what we are saying here is when we just hear the merchant, behind the merchant, who is driving it? Is it going to be what do you call it? Some of these what do you call it now? Is it going to be names? Is it going to be all of these folks? They are behind the merchant, and then they will all get commission, for whatever contribution they are making. The security agency we're also talking about will be very involved in the whole of this process, because they have to be able to eliminate all the illegal tax collectors, all of those area boys who are doing that. Perhaps they might begin to work with NURT, we will not even know, to be able to help them to narrow down a lot of those folks that will do that. I'm only saying, what we have heard is the surface platform in terms of the structure of how it's going to work. But if we look at it on the back end, there will be different layers of people who are supporting the success of that platform that will be incentivized in that process. And I'm sure all of this will be made known at some point. Don't also forget that by the time you are getting to involve the state government and all of that, these might likely go to the National Assembly for legislation. They might even call for public hearing at some point on this matter if care is not taken. You might just see the way it's going to go on, and at the end of the day, there will be a bit of transparency. I don't believe things will go the way it went with Alpha Beta in Lagos, like Basil, exercises fear. But I believe that it's going to go much more better than what we have, in a way that we can, create an inclusive economy for the private, for the informal sector.
Again, we hope to see that. We live to see, right? And we hope that, some of the suggestions over here will be listened to. But let's move away from that and talk about the tax rate itself. As we know, the FIRS has said that it hopes to deal with duplicity in tax collection. Basil has also made the point about the duplicity of the market people themselves paying 7.5 at the point of buying their goods, and then being charged 7.5 again at the point of sale of their goods. And so for me, would the solution then be reducing the tax number over there, or the tax rate at the point of sale? Basil, what do you think? What do you think the solution is really?
Here's my argument. My argument is not against higher taxes. My argument is timing, constitutionality, and in the context of the question that you presented, the ability to ensure that there's no multiplicity. It doesn't make sense that VAT is taxed for informal merchants when they're already buying those goods and certain services where they're already offering, where they're already being charged 7.5%. Make it uniform and maybe expand it. But this is after, of course, you have staggered the implementation of this particular procedure. That's the clarity that I can provide here. We need to expand and widen our tax net, no doubt about that. We need to increase our tax collection rates, but there are ways to do that. And first and foremost, we have to incentivize productivity, which is exactly what the first 2 years of any serious government should be about before bringing about those reforms. But also, just another important point to highlight here. When you're carrying out taxation, there's a social science perspective to it. There's a reason why we have very low tax observant rates in Nigeria. The people, and I'm sure there have been surveys that are already out there proving this point of mine. The people are skeptical about engaging in this particular social contract. because the government or the public government itself, they haven't provided their own end of the agreement. Social
Absolutely.
contract is basically an invisible agreement that we all understand in the context of states or state formation. Government is supposed to protect lives and properties and provide basic services, right? And enable that business basically functions well, right? And then on the other hand, we're supposed to pay taxes, we're supposed to be law-abiding citizens. Government is not providing any of their own end of the deal. And why would you expect people to want to be enthusiastic about paying taxes? So from a social science perspective, government has a lot of work. And when I'm talking about government here, I'm talking about 3 tiers of government. The federal government, the state governments, and the local government areas have a lot of work to do to redeem that trust. And if they're able to do that in the next 2 years, which is not impossible, then they would start to see higher tax collection rates. Unless we do that, what we're going to experience the next 2 years with this new VAT policy for the informal sector is just brazen extortion that is enabled by the federal government.
Indeed. And gentlemen, I'll tell you what, we are out of time. Unfortunately, we cannot continue with our conversation, although there's much more to talk about. Who would have thought that, you know, taxes could give us such great conversation? But thank you. You have been phenomenal in your point.
I would love to give a closing remark. You know,
I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. Fair. It's so fair.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm just saying that just to, in a way, to not to totally disagree with Basil, but these real informal sectors, there won't be multiple taxation for them. I agree with you that the social contract must be honored. And that is why the likes of the governor of Borno State is doing by making provisions of 80 buses for the farmers to be able to move their goods. Majority of these folks don't even pay taxes at all. They just transact within the local environment and they go back to their houses with their cash. I just dare to say that again. Thank you so much for having me on this
Indeed. And again, I'll tell you again, the market women, we've spoken to them today, they have no idea. We hope that if implementation is to take place, communication goes on well. And gentlemen, I've got to say again, thank you for such a great conversation. I hope we meet again on another topic, or perhaps when it really is implemented. There's so much to talk about on this subject. Sure. And I hope it's with you. Thank you so much, Basil. Thank you, Olushiji.